what happens when you're at the end of a long journey, there's an inn ahead, and you want to stop for the night, and maybe you're on an animal like this. Let me explain what I think happens. The medieval inn was a really important location, especially because towards the end of the medieval period, a lot of relatively wealthy merchants were travelling for commerce. There was an expansion in the wool and cloth trade, and people needed to get goods from one place to the other. Now, without a very sophisticated infrastructure, those goods travelled at the speed of foot or hoof, more likely, and therefore people needed places to stay on their journeys, and that led to the massive growth and expansion of the inn trade. Typically, a small town might contain one inn, a market town, a bit more prosperous, a bit more busy, might contain 2 or 3, and a provincial capital, 10, 15 inns. So it shows you how important they were. They were also social centres as well for those places. On arrival at an inn, you'd probably be met by open gates leading onto a central courtyard. Those gates are usually left open during the day, locked at dusk or when the curfew happens, and you'd be met by a servant or porter, as they were sometimes called. That porter would ask your business. You would say, I want to stay the night and I've got 3 pack ponies, and they would say whether there was space or not and what the fee was. And of course, that fee, you would think there would be a lot of haggling. It appears that the fees for staying in inns were fixed by the guilds or by law. There wasn't really haggling for, save money to reduce the price. I imagine prices did change a little bit perhaps, but maybe not. The medieval period is filled with prices that are fixed so that everybody knew what they had to pay for certain things. Your pack ponies, your mules, whatever it might be, would be led away to the stables. You might be asked what they want to eat, and they'd presumably be watered and fed hay. And if you wanted to give them a hard feed, like horse bread or something like that, then you'd possibly pay extra. But basically, they'd have a place that would be secure, and your goods would be placed somewhere secure as well. And then you would go off, perhaps, to meet the innkeeper or to go to the common room and have a well-earned beer or drink of some sort. A place to stay when you're travelling was of course not a medieval invention at all. Inns have been part of travel infrastructure since antiquity. Ancient Persia and ancient Rome had very sophisticated places to stay for travellers, and those were typically run kind of almost on an imperial basis. They were run not exactly by the state but by the system. The system needed that kind of infrastructure to enable it. The medieval inns tended to be a little bit more random and private. They sprung up in places that were important to have an inn, important for a place to stay, and so were a bit more chaotic. Now, the Roman inns typically were based largely on the villa structure, which was an interior courtyard and rooms around the outside, and that was just duplicated in the inns, the medieval inns. And it's quite useful. It serves a purpose. It means you're going through a threshold, you're somewhere a little bit safe. Depending on how the structure is built, it could be slightly defensive if the windows on the ground floor only open up inside into the courtyard. The gate can be shut at night, and probably was shut at night, because let's face it, you don't want too many people coming in after dark. They're usually miscreants and the dodgy types. But it also serves the purpose of not letting people leave if they haven't paid their bills. So those gates effectively lock the clientele in to make sure that bills were settled, or at least some kind of structure was made for payment for people. Because let's face it, in the medieval period, if you could get away on a fast horse, you could get away ahead of the data, ahead of the news, because the news travelled at the speed of a galloping horse or a trotting or cantering horse, to be honest, and people might not be able to recognise you as well. So there were fewer people around, so strangers were perhaps more recognised, but at the same time there was no data infrastructure to pass the word on that somebody had absconded but not paid their bill. So I think there's a little bit of that as well. And also people felt safer if they were sleeping in a more secure type of accommodation. Medieval inns, by their very nature, were melting pots for people who had been travelling from one place to another. And when people met, they talked. And when they talked, they spread news, they spread gossip. And of course, that was a major source of information for local people. Travelling people brought news of what was going on, and the news only travelled at the speed of the people spreading it. So they were important places for exchange of information, and a lot of trade was done as well at your local inn. You'd meet interesting people, rumours would be spread, but also social uprising and discussions would be had with travellers just resting, chatting to other people who maybe come from the continent or come from other places and heard things. You might be unsurprised to hear that quite a lot of social uprisings actually kicked off in inns. They were quite notorious as hotbeds of discontent and rabble-rousing. And in fact, some of the biggest social uprisings actually started in various types of inn. Medieval inns were owned in different ways. It might be the local innkeeper actually physically owned it. It was just a private institution. They might be owned by the local lord of the manor. They might be owned by the local abbey. They could be owned by guilds. There's all sorts of different ownership structures. But what we do know is they were very wealthy, good money-making institutions. So people wanted to own an inn, if they possibly could, in a good location. Inns were of course run by the innkeeper, but there were an awful lot of other staff involved as well. So depending on the scale of the inn and the busyness of it, there would be a whole bunch of different numbers of people doing all sorts of different tasks. Some innkeepers paid rent, others kept the money themselves. Compared to most local businesses, inns were the big thing. They were the wealthiest place, and they could earn a reasonable time between £5 and £10 a year. That was significantly more than most other businesses in the local area. As a result, the innkeeper was often a very, very important member of the local society. In fact, we have records of how successful some of them actually were. Richard Kingsmill was a town constable, a local magistrate, town bailiff, and also became a member of parliament as a result of, I guess, the money he earned through being an innkeeper. He was also a trader in all sorts of goods like fish and cloth and wine, and he is recorded as having a flock of over 200 sheep. Were there any women innkeepers? Yes, there were. The records say that about 20% of innkeepers in the medieval period were female. Inns, of course, came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The smaller ones had a smaller group of people looking after them and smaller number of clientele and a smaller turnover, obviously. Very busy ones actually had a very significant team of people doing very specialist jobs. So, for example, there was the innkeeper, but there were also things like accountancy staff, people that had to kind of maintain the books. You had cleaners and cooks, you had maintenance staff, you had security if you needed it, the porter, as I mentioned before. You might even have horse handlers or mule handlers or donkey handlers, whatever they might be, because all your travellers are going to likely have creatures with them. They're going to have beasts of burden. It's not like cars can just be parked in a car park. They actually need to be looked after. There's a whole other area there of infrastructure that we don't tend to think of in a motel, for example. So you've got all the creature handlers as well, and you would also need a place to secure valuables and wealthy things, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. But if you imagine you were in a fantasy setting with unusual types of beasts of burden, maybe hippogriffs or unicorns or whatever it is that you're riding on, you're going to need to keep them as well. And in a fantasy setting, I know it's not particularly medieval, but a lot of them are based on the medieval setting. You're going to need to keep those kind of creatures separate. You're going to need specialist handlers for them. You can't mix hippogriffs with horses, because hippogriffs eat horses in the wild. That's going to cause a lot of problems, let alone if somebody's riding a dragon and needs to keep a dragon overnight. So your infrastructure of an inn is going to reflect the needs of its clientele. And if it's medieval, you've got ponies, pack ponies. They don't need much space. They just need a place really to stand out of the wind, possibly not even under shelter, but often under shelter. They don't need a stable as such. They would be kept in what are called standings, which is just enough room for a horse to stand tied up to a ring with a bit of flexibility. It needs its water, it needs its hay, and it'll just stand there and wait and snooze on its 2 feet. Horses don't often lie down when they're in strange places. They'll lie down when they feel relaxed, but often they won't lie down if they're somewhere strange. They'll just snooze standing on all four legs. Same with ponies, same with mules. Don't know about other creatures though. So you had a whole bunch of different people, and you'd have a different structure. Typically you'd have a common room, you'd have a private location for the innkeeper and the innkeeper's family. You'd also perhaps have accommodation for some of the staff. You might need to have a local tavern, a tavern associated with the inn, a tavern as part of the inn as well. Privacy was a bit of a luxury in the medieval period, and so a lot of people would have slept in common rooms. They would have just slept multiple people to a bed, if they even had a bed, or have a corner and a pallet and just sleep there. Or actually, even in the simplest types of inns, just sleep around the fire where they fell or where they lay down to sleep. Out of the wind, not necessarily particularly warm, but better than sleeping outside. And remember, most people probably wouldn't have removed anything but their outer clothes to sleep. So they'd taken their shoes off and their cloaks and hoods maybe, but then they've just gone to bed in their clothes really. That's a way to stay warm, no form of central heating. So you pretty much didn't do that. Bathing, there probably wasn't bathing at most inns. That was usually done in a specific location like a bathhouse. Washing facilities would have been available, which would have been a bowl and a jug of water and a cloth really. You'd probably bring your own cloth. The water would be supplied. Wash your hands and your face and other various bits and bobs, but you're not going to sit there having a shower or having a bath, not unless you're in a very wealthy inn and you're going to spend a lot of money on hot water. It's possible, I suppose, but it's extremely unlikely. And I haven't found any records of inns with significant washing facilities. There's obviously an associated bathhouse sometimes in a big town or city, but not sort of shower rooms as such or bathrooms in an inn. There would of course be toilets, and solid waste and liquid waste were collected separately. You would be expected to know that as a traveller. You would do your solid waste into a long drop or over a barrel. That would be collected by gong farmers because that was a valuable resource. And your piss would also be collected in a separate barrel and used for all sorts of different industrial purposes, used for bleaching linen, used for tanning leather, used in all sorts of different industries, and was very valuable. Your piss, once it left your body, didn't actually belong to you anymore. It belonged to whoever was collecting it, whatever guild had the rights to the waste from your body. Something we're not very used to today with the ability to flush everything, but you would be expected to behave that way. Inns had their own storage, of course. They typically had cellars, different types of cellars, much beloved of first-level adventurers going down to the cellar to get rid of the rats. But they genuinely did exist, and those cellars were not really artificially heated or cooled, but by being underground, by being sort of below ground level, they maintained a roughly fridge-like temperature, roughly 5 degrees, which is similar, slightly damp, similar to a modern day fridge perhaps in some ways. So that would typically store root vegetables, wines. Beer probably wasn't stored because it was made and drunk as quickly as possible. Wine was probably stored. You might have cereals and grains stored there as well as some meats hanging and aging on meat hooks for later. Broadly speaking, that was the storage rooms for the inn. If you wanted to look after valuables, gold or gems or whatever it might be, you could use a lockbox. Most inns provided a lockbox. That lockbox would be kept in the living accommodation of the innkeeper. So you would have to do a deal with the innkeeper. He'd fill you in a receipt and he'd put your gold in his solid lockbox, and that was kept inside his living accommodation and given back to you after a fee was taken in the morning, and you'd get your goods back. It's also possible that there were live-in entertainers. There were people that were troubadours that would sort of make their money by staying at the inn semi-permanently, or maybe staying a few weeks and then travelling, moving on. And they may stay on site as well. So you might have long-term residents, if you like, of the inn that aren't necessarily servants, they aren't necessarily workers, certainly not the innkeeper or travellers, but just sort of hung around because it was such an important and busy place. You also might have people gathering intelligence in the inn. as well. So if there were robbers who were going to try and rob wealthy people later on after they've travelled on from the inn, well, maybe they would be hanging around trying to listen to see who's got the most money, who's a likely prospect, who's going to be their next victim. So you have to keep your eyes open a little bit on people listening to your conversations, and just be a little bit cautious that those dodgy strangers in a cloak with a hood smoking a pipe in the corner might actually not be up to any good. They might, of course, be heroes of the tale, but often they would not be. And we know in later periods that highwaymen, robbers, used to frequent certain inns, and I'm pretty sure that would have been done with the knowledge of the innkeeper, and the innkeeper probably got cut in to some of the ill-gotten gains. Dick Turpin, for example, used to hang around inns and rob people the next day if he'd established who he was going to rob. So there's some interesting potential threats for medieval travellers there. In the morning, you'd probably get up at around dawn. A lot of medieval things typically really use the daylight, so depending on the time of year, that would vary. But basically, you'd get up at dawn, just before dawn perhaps, pack your things, pay your bill, and head off. Now, you might have met new friends, you might be travelling with them and decide to travel with them to the next destination. You might have met enemies and they might be following you as well. You might be suspicious and you might suspect something, and maybe you hire somebody to go along with you. Travelling in groups was something that pilgrims did, and often they actually hired security. They hired Knights Templar to go with them to protect them. In medieval England, that doesn't get mentioned very much. There were Templars, but they didn't really guard pony trains or anything like that. That was just up to the individual to do. You'd pack up and head off on your journey, and a new set of people would presumably turn up towards the end of that day. So during the day, the inns possibly got quite quiet. There'll be local commerce, there'll be local guilds, perhaps renting a back room for events, but the travellers would typically come in towards the end of the day, towards dusk. They would come in. So the inn would be very busy in the morning, very busy in the evening, possibly not so busy during the middle of the day. Medieval inns must have been very interesting places, potentially slightly dangerous, potentially slightly rough. There would be all sorts of different people from different places crossing paths, exchanging news, gossip, information, trade, doing deals. I think they would have been a kind of nerve centre of the medieval town or city, and therefore a very important place. There is a cliche, of course, in role-playing games, often things start in a tavern or an inn. I think that's actually quite likely. I think those were the places that people would be seen to hang out, and it wouldn't be unusual to see strangers that you've never seen before and end up talking to them. That's what people did. That's how they exchanged information. So inns in particular were really fascinating nexus points for medieval society.